Ken Ween. Welcome to It Matters Radio. With me today is always my wonderful co-host, Monica Brinkman.
Hello, all.
And Monica and I today have two guests. One is a musician by the name of Charlie Rauh, and the other is a writer by the name of Diane Denton. And Diane, Monica, and I have known each other years and years because we shared the same publisher, All Things That Matter Press. And Diane has just come out with a new book. It's this one here. I actually have a print copy. It's called Without the Veil Between, Anne Bronte, A Fine and Subtle Spirit. Anne Bronte. Now, okay, I want to take you back, folks. There was a young woman on the throne of England. No, not Elizabeth, Victoria. And we're talking about the earlier part of the 19th century. England was rising to prominence in the world, all because, pretty much because somebody, a Scotsman by the name of Watt, had come up with something called a steam engine, and it changed the world. It produced what was called the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, a lot of people don't even realize that nowadays. Yeah.
And, okay, but it was a very old-fashioned world. Very old-fashioned and Victorian. and people were expected to live in very circumscribed lives, especially women. And even though the most powerful person on the earth at that time could arguably have been called this young woman, this young queen, other women were expected to mind their P's and Q's. And that was particularly true of the children of clergy, and that meant the three surviving daughters of the Bronte family, Charlotte, who is perhaps best remembered for her wonderful novel Jane Eyre, Emily, next in the birth order, who wrote a wonderful novel that you may very well have read called Wuthering Heights. And the third, the least known, the youngest, Anne, who among other things wrote a novel called The Tenant of Windfell Hall. And,
Wildfell Hall.
Wildfell Hall.
Wildfell Hall.
Okay.
I've never heard
She
of
also
that.
wrote another. Her first book was Agnes Grey. She wrote
Yeah,
two.
she also wrote Agnes.
Or she published two.
Yeah. And these three sisters, looking back now, really almost defined the Elizabethan, the Victorian novel. They did wonderful, wonderful writers. They also wrote some great poetry. But they never married. And so they were writing about emotions. They were writing about relationships, and they themselves were unable to have, which makes these novels particularly poignant. So Diane Denton happens to like the Brontes.
Yeah.
And so she started reading, and then she got particularly interested. She hadn't started out being particularly interested in Anne, but then she started to really get interested in this young woman, Anne Bronte. So what was it about Anne Bronte that particularly attracted you, Diane?
Well, first of all, let me tell you how I got to write the novel. I initially, after I'd written my first two novels, I thought about writing maybe a series of novelettes to put into one volume of women writers who were basically overlooked or neglected. Mm-hmm. And Anne was at the top of the list.
Yeah.
And when I started to write about her, a friend of mine, who's also a publisher and a wonderful writer, you got to write a novel about her. And I'm like, there's not enough information. I don't think that I can, but once I started, and realized that I could, and that's how the novel was born. And the other women writers, well, I'm on the second now, Christina Rossetti, so I'm writing a novel about her now.
Okay.
And, well, like you probably read at the back of the book, I have a little piece about how I came to know about the Brontes through my mother, who had a beautiful, well, 2 volumes. She had Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre in the 1943 edition that had woodcuts, beautiful woodcuts by a German, I think he was German, Friedrich Eichreich or something like that. And so she gave those, passed those on to me when I was about 11 or 12, and I was just riveted. You know, they were big books with double columns, the kind of old-fashioned printing that you just don't see anymore, and
Yes.
book binding, beautiful volumes. She didn't have, Anne's actually weren't included in those publications. But that's how I started, and that was way back, and really drawn to Emily most, because I'm rather a private person. I loved her poetry and just her very self-contained, mystical, pagan, almost pagan view of things, even at that age. So Anne came much later. Anne
was something a little different, because her idea of a woman tended to be more independent, I think.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing that a lot of people don't realize. If they know anything about Anne, they probably have heard that she was very quiet, very reserved, very pious, which she was those things. But I think she, maybe even in a way more than Charlotte, was more progressive. She wanted to write about what she observed, experienced, what the behavior of other people, not so much in a fanciful way, but in a more realistic way.
Yeah.
And that kind of got her in trouble too with the Tenant of Wildfield Hall, because there's a story about a woman who actually, you know, marries into an aristocrat who is a drunkard and is abusive and all the things that we could relate to today, and decides to run away and take her child with her, which was basically kidnapping in those days. Women weren't allowed to do that. Yeah. So it was a pretty scandalous idea that based her novel on, and a woman living alone.
One of the first women's lib people.
Yeah.
Now,
I think
it says a lot about Anne that she was much more progressive, much more outgoing in that sense. She wasn't afraid.
She was also much more realistic about her brother in that sense.
Yes. Well,
her brother was.
It all stemmed from, she was governess for a family that Robinsons at my mind. Anyway, she was a governess for them at Thorpe Green. Got a blank there for a minute. And she got her brother a job there as a tutor, trying to help him because he was having trouble keeping employment and such. So she thought this is the perfect job for him. Well, the story is probably not absolutely proven, but that he had an affair with the mistress of the house. So it didn't work out all so well. And of course,
never change, do they?
No. Poor Anne, who tried to help him, ended up, probably ruining the day that she did. But it was very hard for her. I mean, sure, it was very hard. She loved her brother, but to have to see that happen and see him destroy himself, basically, because it just wasn't a good thing that he ended up doing, and probably caused pretty much his demise. So she really, she had that, and she had probably just her observation of being a governess. I mean, I know Charlotte's known for writing the governess novel of all times, but Anne's, even her first novel, Agnes Grey, is about being a governess, probably even more true to life. Her first job, which was for a family, the children turned out to be terrors in the family. She actually got fired from the job. Anne actually ended up tying the two children that she was a governess to a chair because they were so bad at one point. So that kind of says that there was a lot more to Anne than people like to think, that she was just gentle and passive, and so yeah. There's so many things when you start exploring a character that you think you know about, and you find out so much more if you really, you know, you have to read a lot of sources, a lot of biographies, you get a lot of different interpretations. But also, I think just looking at their work is probably the place, their poetry, their prose, whatever, you know.
You use a lot of her language in the book.
Yeah. Well, I kind of like to use their writing to some degree, but when you write about a writer, it's kind of like making a movie about a writer. You just can't have them sitting there writing all the time. It really isn't that interesting. I mean, it might be to me as a writer, but to other people, it's like a musician like Charlie, you know, you love to see other people just play music, but.
Yeah, but there's much more. And the fact, Diane, that you did such research to find out who she really was so you could present that says a lot. And I don't think people realize what goes into writing a book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they don't.
And it doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction, you still have to do a lot of fact finding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wanted to draw our attention over here to Charlie Rauh.
Yes, please.
Where does Charlie enter it now? Charlie, you're not going to play the role of Bramwell, the wastrel brother, for us. So how do you enter into this interview? What is your connection to Without the Veil Between?
Well, I came across Diane and her book through a Facebook group, a walk around the Bronte table, and we both had, you know, followed some posts that we had made as we were both pretty clearly focused on Anne. And it's actually interesting, my gateway into the Brontes was also Emily. As a child, I was very, very into Emily Dickinson. And a few years ago, a lot of years ago, probably about a decade ago, I actually visited her home for the first time, the Dickinson Museum. And that's where I found out, I was aware of the Brontes, but had never read anything. And that's when I found out that Emily was her favorite poet, and that she supposedly had No Coward Soul Is Mine read at her funeral, or she requested that it be read at her funeral. So after I heard that, I started sort of looking into Emily's poems. And for years, I never read Wuthering Heights. I was just enamored with Emily's poetry. And at a certain point, I started, I write solo guitar music for a record label called Destiny Records, and I released 2 records before the current record that's about to come out, that I'll get to in a second. But I started writing some solo guitar music about Emily's poems. And then my gateway into the rest of the Brontes happened when I read Agnes Grey. And that's still probably my favorite book I've ever read. And that led me to Anne's poetry. And Anne's poetry just completely knocked me over. Whereas Emily is Diane put it in a really well-said manner, but mystical, thoughtful, you know, provocative, just fascinating, and I mean, pretty objectively genius, just brilliant poetry. And Anne's is just so stark and just like a slap in the face almost, which really had an effect on me musically. So I started writing about writing music about Anne's poems, which led me to the relationship between Emily and Anne. As Ellen Nussey said, they were like twins, that they were these completely opposite, or not opposite, that's not fair, but very different different characters.
Synergy between them.
Yeah.
I love that. I love what
This is an aside, folks. Of course, these 3 women all wrote wonderful poetry, but they couldn't get it published because they were women. So if you want to find their original book of poetry, you have to look under men's names. And so they published the original poetry as, what was it, Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. And it was, only later on when they became in great demand, and finally and there's a wonderful scene in your book where show up in London at the
Miss
publisher.
Sharon and Emily would not go. Emily did not want her identity revealed.
And then, oh my gosh, now what do we do? And if you think about it for a moment, this is actually becomes an issue for the world at that time. You know, it's like, hey, we got a guy now who's talking about nominating a woman vice president. No, won't be the first.
Imagine coming from that to this.
Yeah, and this is at that level, and even more ground shaking for the people. And my God, these great poets, these great writers, women. Not possible.
Well, can I insert why they ended up to go to London? Basically because the rumor was when it I think was it with Jane Eyre became very popular in the States in America, and there was a rumor that they were all written basically by the same person, and Charlotte was not happy and wanted to clear that up, so she said to them, we're going to London and we're going to go to the publisher and we're going to reveal who is. Yeah. So Anne went with her. It was the spur of the moment thing.
Diane, I want to catch up because, you know, one of the things we try very hard to do on It Matters Radio is to get people to buy books. So we don't want to tell you too much of what's in the book, folks, because it's a good read.
Although it's all stuff that they could.
Yeah.
So
okay.
So Charlie, you put some of Ian's poetry to music, or written music of songs about Ian, or what have you done?
The record that I have coming out is called The Bluebell, and what they are, they're instrumental solo acoustic guitar songs, sort of like lullabies. They're very short, about 1.5 minutes on average. And so they're instrumental. There's no direct literal relation to the poems. It's just my interpretation of the poems through my music, which is something that Diane and I bonded on immediately when we started talking. And I started looking into Diane's books because without the veil between the subtitle there, I have my copy right here actually, but of a fine and subtle spirit, a fine and subtle spirit dwells is the bluebell. It's a line from the poem. So we both had chosen that poem as the namesake of our respective works and our admiration for Anne. And when I read Diane's novel, I related so much to her interpretation of Anne. Because as Diane said, there's not a whole lot known. I guess the closest documentation would be the diary papers that Emily and Anne wrote separately and together to get details on Anne's personality outside of her poems and her novels. But the way Diane brought Anne to life is exactly how I myself imagine Anne, the type of personality she would have been, and just the nuanced, almost overwhelmed, brilliant woman that she was. So yeah, it's really cool that for whatever reason we both honed in on that specific poem, which it's a well-known poem, but it's not one of the first ones that would typically come up with Anne either. So I really enjoyed that element of, just discovering Diane and her work, that for whatever reason, that specific poem spoke to us for our projects.
We're definitely going to be playing
yes.
a sample of this.
Yeah, after the end, gonna be
when I saw when I realized what Charlie had done with his compositions, and how the Bluebell was the name of his album and the inspiration for one of the tracks, Anne's Bluebell. And I said to him, because I had used public domain music on my trailer, so I was, hey Charlie, what about using that, on my trailer? And he was like, yeah, sure. So that was really where the connection.
That's all I can say. I mean, to meet on Facebook.
I was thrilled.
Have this connection.
Are we going to be able to show the trailer too?
Yeah, we could, right? Yeah. It's on YouTube.
Yeah.
Okay. Folks, at the end of the show, we're going to have one of Charlie's songs, and then we're going to have the trailer for
And
Diane,
Charlie's music changed the whole ambience of my trailer. It's amazing how music can really affect, I mean, even words or even pictures, you know,
Now,
which is
Charlie,
basically my trailer. It just completely changed it. And at first it was so different. And then I'm like, wow, this is so much more Anne. Just, you know, like he said, you know, even with my book, but the energy he's put into the music is so appropriate. It just goes deep. It goes deep into both Emily and Anne's.
So I want to make sure we help people find out where. Now, you know, what we're going to do, of course, is underneath the description here on the show, we're going to have links. We're going to have a link to folks to buy the book, okay? And then we're also going to have a link, Charlie, to your music. Do you have your own website, Charlie?
Yeah, actually, that might be the easiest way. My website is just my name, CharlieRauh, one word.com. And on the homepage, as soon as you go there, there's a link to order or stream or whatever you'd like to listen to the music.
Now, Charlie, I wanted to bring up that you have done this before. I mean, this isn't the first time that you've written music to go with a specific project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
In fact, you've done this, I believe in, I can't remember it off the top of my head right now, but I know it was for people in New York and in different areas that you've done it for.
Yes. Yeah. And I collaborate with my sister often. So we actually had a project that came out last year. I was an artist in residence for the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation in 2018. And while I was there, I composed some music that included, it was sort of the beginning of really exploring writing lullabies based on poetry when I explored The Sentence by Anna Akhmatova. So that was on that record, and I started recording some more music, and my sister Christina Rauh Fishburne is a fiction writer. So we often exchange music. She sends me what she's working on for me to read, and I send her music. So that record called Hearaith, which is based on a Welsh word that means to miss a place that never existed, was more or less music about traveling and missing places and just sort of wanderlust and, you know, the mysticism, if you will, that comes along with that. And I was sending that music to my sister, and she wound up writing this really wonderful short story based on the music.
Based on the music?
And yeah, and then we came up with this really great idea. My sister also is a massive Bronte fan, and she, riffing off of that, she created a limited edition of tiny books, like what Charlotte and Branwell made.
Wonderful. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, so that was the first time we, yeah, it was fun.
You know, it's very interesting. Before we run out of time, I just wanted to point out. Now, you two, have you ever met in person?
No.
I have never
This
met.
is the first time we've spoken to each other.
The first time you've even seen each other.
No,
Yeah.
I've seen Charlie. He does a lot of this kind of thing. So first time we've spoken to each other.
It's amazing how we can use the social media to make, and other forms of using the internet, to make real connections that enrich our lives, but also enrich the lives of other people. So here, folks, we have this friendship formed on Facebook that has helped to enrich a book and a record, both of which Monica and I think you would enjoy if you care about good art and good culture. You will enjoy both the book and the record. Now, the record, what is the title you're giving this collection of songs?
It's called The Bluebell.
The Bluebell.
Bluebell, right.
Bluebell, after the poem. And Diane, the name of the novel?
Without the Veil Between, Anne Bronte, a fine and subtle spirit. My own novel.
And
Sorry.
folks, really delightful stuff Yeah.
It is. And
Thank you.
Charlie, there's one thing I liked also. You have posted the words of poetry that goes along with the music, so people will get that full effect. And then read the book. Oh my goodness. You'll be hearing the music in your head as you're reading.
I hope so.
Or you can read the book first so you can appreciate the music more. Or
Either way.
go back and
Play the music while you read the book.
most importantly, I want to thank you both, Charlie Rauh and Diane Denton, for joining us today on It Matters Radio. It's really been just wonderful talking with you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you,
You
Ken
guys
and
keep in
Monica.
touch and let us know what's going on, okay?
Oh, we will.
Okay.
Okay,
Take
here we
care.
go, guys. You're in for a treat. Bye-bye.
Bye.